I was 53 years old the day my son told me that the house I had lived in for nearly 30 years wasn't really mine anymore. He didn't say it in anger. That would have been easier to accept. He said it the way people talk about something obvious, something already decided. The way someone might explain that winter eventually turns into spring. Calm, logical, final. The strange thing about betrayal inside a family is that it rarely begins as betrayal. It begins as concern. At least, that's how it sounded when my son Daniel first started bringing up the topic of planning ahead. My name is Eleanor Hayes. For most of my life, I believed I had done everything the right way. I married young, raised 2 children, worked part-time when they were small and full-time when they were older. My husband Thomas and I bought our house when interest rates were high and money was tight. We paid every bill, fixed every broken pipe ourselves, and celebrated the day the mortgage was finally gone. That house wasn't fancy. It was a modest brick home in a quiet suburban neighborhood where people still waved when they drove past. But every corner of it carried memories. My daughter's height marks penciled into the laundry room wall. But over time, the house became something else. It became proof that I could still stand on my own. I paid the taxes myself. I handled the repairs. I learned how to manage the finances Thomas had always taken care of. It wasn't easy at first. But slowly, life settled into a quieter rhythm. Then Daniel started visiting more often. At first, I was grateful. After Thomas died, my children both lived in different cities. My daughter Claire had a busy life with 2 small kids and a demanding job. Daniel lived only an hour away, but before that year he rarely visited more than a few times during the holidays. Suddenly he was coming by almost every weekend. He'd bring groceries, fix small things around the house, mow the lawn before I even had the chance to ask. I remember telling my neighbor one afternoon how proud I was that my son cared so much about me. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if the signs were there from the beginning. One afternoon we were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when Daniel asked casually if I had updated my will since Dad passed away. The question surprised me, but he asked it the way someone asks if you've changed the batteries in a smoke detector. Sensible. Responsible. I told him I hadn't thought much about it yet. He nodded thoughtfully and said, "You should probably take care of that sooner rather than later." That was the first time. The next time he brought up something called a power of attorney. He explained that it was simply a legal tool, something responsible families used in case an elderly parent became ill or unable to manage things. His tone was patient, almost educational, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who simply hadn't heard about it before. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. Over the next few months, Daniel mentioned the idea several more times. Always gently, always in a tone that suggested he was looking out for my best interests. Eventually he scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. I remember sitting in that office feeling slightly embarrassed that I didn't fully understand the paperwork being placed in front of me. The lawyer spoke quickly, using phrases that sounded official and reassuring. Daniel sat beside me, nodding along. "It's just precautionary," he said quietly. So I signed. Life went on. For a while nothing changed. Then about a year later, Daniel began talking about the house. It started with small comments. He would point out the cost of repairs or mention how difficult it might become for someone my age to manage such a large property. He talked about real estate prices rising quickly in the neighborhood. He said things like, "You could sell this place and live somewhere much more comfortable." I always brushed the idea away. That house wasn't just property. It was the last place in the world where I still felt close to Thomas. But Daniel kept returning to the subject. Not aggressively. Not in a way that would start an argument. Just often enough that the idea began to linger in the back of my mind. One evening he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said something that made my stomach tighten. "You know," he said carefully, "if we sold the house now, you could move into a smaller place closer to us. It would be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. Those words stayed with me long after he left. For weeks I thought about the conversation. About whether he might be right. About whether I was being stubborn holding on to something that no longer made practical sense. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I had just returned from the grocery store when I noticed a sign planted in the front yard. A real estate sign. For a moment I stood there on the sidewalk staring at it, certain there had to be some mistake. The logo belonged to a local agency I recognized. Beneath it was a bright red panel that read simply, "For sale." My hands started shaking before I even reached the front door. Inside the house, everything looked exactly the same. The furniture hadn't moved. The curtains were still drawn the way I left them that morning. But the sign outside was real. I called Daniel immediately. When he answered, his voice sounded calm, almost relieved that the conversation was finally happening. "Yes," he said. "I meant to tell you earlier. The house is listed." I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "How could it be listed?" I asked. "It's my house." There was a pause. Then Daniel said something that felt like the ground shifting under my feet. "You signed the power of attorney, Mom. Legally, I'm allowed to manage these decisions for you." For several seconds I couldn't speak. The realization arrived slowly, like cold water rising around my ankles. He hadn't just been planning for the future. He had been planning around me. Over the next few days, I learned just how far those plans had gone. The house had already been photographed, listed online. Showings had been scheduled for the following week. Daniel explained it all in the language of efficiency and practicality. He talked about market timing, investment opportunities, long-term financial planning. He said I would thank him later. That night I didn't sleep. I walked through every room of the house in the quiet darkness, touching walls and furniture like someone preparing to say goodbye. But sometime around 3 in the morning, something inside me shifted. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt angry. Not loud, explosive anger. The kind that moves slowly and quietly but refuses to disappear. The next morning I called a lawyer of my own. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time it ended, I understood 2 things very clearly. First, the power of attorney Daniel held did give him authority, but only under specific conditions. And second, as long as I was mentally competent, I had every right to revoke it. That afternoon I drove to the lawyer's office and signed a new document. One that canceled Daniel's authority immediately. Then I called the real estate agent. Her confusion was almost painful to listen to. She had been told that Daniel was acting entirely on my behalf. When I explained the situation, the showing appointments scheduled for the following week were canceled before sunset. 2 hours later, Daniel called. This time his voice was not calm. For the first time in his life, my son sounded genuinely angry with me. But by then something inside me had already changed. For years I had been the kind of person who avoided conflict at any cost. The kind who apologized even when I wasn't entirely sure what I had done wrong. That evening, when Daniel finished explaining why I had made a terrible mistake, I said something I had never said to him before. No. Just that. One word. No. The silence on the other end of the line lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then he hung up. In the weeks that followed, our relationship shifted into unfamiliar territory. Conversations became shorter. Visits became less frequent. But the house remained mine. And slowly, something else began to return. Peace. Because sometimes the most important victory in a family isn't proving someone wrong. It's remembering that your life, your choices, and your home were never meant to belong to anyone else in the first place.